This is the 19th century. A pivotal, tumultuous age that witnessed revolutions in industry, technology, and politics. But also, crucially, in ideas. Big, bold, dangerous ideas that would bring the world as we know it kicking and screaming into being. Three great thinkers led the way: Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Sigmund Freud. They lived in a time when old certainties were breaking down. Regimes were overthrown by mass uprisings. Science was undermining religious authority. Their challenge was to figure out what makes us human in a fast-evolving world. Emigres, recluses, enemies of the state, these outsiders challenged the existential crisis of their age head-on. Little was out of bounds. They had an absolute commitment to identify the forces controlling our lives, their weapon, the power of their minds. Their search drove them to extremes, into poverty, into madness. Yet their penetrating, often contentious ways of seeing the world still shape how we make sense of our lives today. Of all the great historical figures buried in Highgate Cemetery, there's one who continues to divide opinion like no other. For those who come here year in, year out to mark the day of his death, Karl Marx is a keenly intelligent analyst of capitalism, a prophet of human emancipation. But for others who've actually attacked this monument with paint, with hacksaws, even with explosives, he's a malign progenitor of totalitarian regimes, a man responsible for the death of millions. Love him or loathe him, what you cannot dispute is that Karl Marx dramatically transformed our world.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? So that is pretty much the thesis right there. Love him or loathe him, right? Transformed the world, the way in which tradition met with the changing times, the scientific expanse of not just technology, but the globe itself, the way in which human beings were being used by their government for their economic prosperity or lack thereof. So that is the starting point. And although Sigmund Freud and Friedrich Nietzsche are also very fascinating figures, we're not gonna watch those.
Within 70 years of his death, 1/3 of the world's population was ruled by governments claiming Marxism as their doctrine. Marxist ideology claimed to be liberating, but led to dreadful suffering and brought superpowers to the brink of Armageddon.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
Communism was widely discredited, precipitating its fall in the 1980s and 90s. But economic crisis and social unrest have put Marx's ideas back in the spotlight. I want to start at the beginning, not to study Marx with the hindsight of history, but to try to understand what motivated him in the context of his own times. to discover how a man whose life was plagued with insecurities, with failure, with tragedy, would end up generating one of the most influential ideologies in the human experience. We tend to think of Marx as a rather imposing greybeard figure, staring out sternly from Soviet propaganda. But this early image of the young Marx, dashing, dapper, privileged, offers a rather different story. His birthplace, Trier, was an elegant Rhineland town, now part of modern Germany. Born in 1818 to upwardly mobile parents in this handsome building, Marx's childhood was, on the face of it, pretty idyllic and thoroughly bourgeois. But one day when Marx was just 15, his father Heinrich met with a group of respected public figures here at Trier's Casino Club. After too much to drink, some of them began pounding the tables raucously and singing songs that celebrated the virtues of the great revolution that swept through neighbouring France. A Prussian army officer witnessed the scene and reported back. Two of Marx's school teachers, who were also in the room, were promptly sacked. Others were charged with subversion, and Marx's father was tarnished with the disgrace. No, was put under surveillance. Under the surface calm of the town, there was tension. Not long before Karl's birth, Trier had been under Napoleonic control, which meant that people like Karl's father had got a taste of the French revolutionary principles of individual liberty, equality. Under French law, Heinrich had been free to train as a lawyer, but he was Jewish, and once the more autocratic Prussians were in control, they imposed civil restrictions on all Jews. Now, in order to keep practicing his profession, he had to convert to Christianity. Marx was growing up in a period when questions of political authority and freedom of expression were highly contested, when ruling classes across Europe feared their people would rise up and overthrow them. The struggle between the ideals of the French Revolution and the intractable conservatism of the Prussian state would inspire and motivate Marx. And from an early age, it was pretty clear where his allegiance lay. When he was 17, Marx was packed off down the Moselle River to study law at Bonn University. There was clearly something of the hellraiser about the teenage Marx. He quickly became co-president of the Trier Tavern Club, basically a bunch of middle-class bad boys. After one night of boozy brawling, Marx was banged up in the local cells for a day. But there was more to come. Student life was divided along class and political lines to the point of conflict. The liberal Trier Tavern boys attracted the attention of a gang of aristocratic cadets. Now, those cadets forced them to kneel down and swear their allegiance to the Prussian aristocracy. And the confrontations escalated. At one point, Marx ended up in a duel with a sabre wound above his eye, a scar which this young scrapper wore as a badge of honour. Enough, it seems, was enough for Marx's father. Heinrich transferred Karl to the more studious environment of Berlin University. Yet, even here, Marx found other distractions. Marx met a group of bohemian students and lecturers who loved to discuss the philosophies of the day late into the night. He grew a beard and joined the Young Hegelians, a group obsessed with the theories of a university professor who'd recently died, George Hegel.
Marx describes his first encounter with Hegel as one of a completely extraordinary moment. He says that when he read Hegel, it was like the curtain had fallen from his eyes.
And what is it about Hegel? What's particularly exciting about his ideas?
Berlin is awash with Hegelian ideas, but perhaps the most important idea of Hegel's that they are completely captivated by is the idea of history as this gradual unfolding of freedom and of reason. And this gradual dialectic, as he called it, was made manifest most magnificently in the French Revolution, when, of course, you had a literal cracking open of freedom and of reason.
I suppose it is totally thrilling, this, isn't it? Because you're being told that you're part of a big historical story, and that gives you a big historical and philosophical canvas to paint on.
That's right, and I think that Marx does absolutely see himself as kind of standing, as it were, towards the end of history that had begun with the ancient philosophers who had talked about the way in which one's soul could only find perfection if it was properly embedded in the community.
And do they think that Hegel's got it absolutely right, or is there a sense that there's still work to do?
There's absolutely still work to do. So they think that while Hegel had got, in his vision, had got part of the way, that what they want to do is bring a total revolution rather than just reform. They were operating in a world where the nobility, the privileged, the aristocracy were still very much in charge, and they were pushing up against a great kind of wall of privilege and tradition.
Marx and the Young Hegelians believed that the single greatest obstacle to human progress was religion. So they set out to critique and to attack it. Now, you've got to think how subversive this is. Some said that the Gospels of the New Testament were just folk tales, not divine historical truth. That's really shocking. Others suggested that God was an illusion, and that as humans we'd taken the best of our powers and projected them onto a kind of fantastical, fabricated being who embodied our finest qualities. The Young Hegelians believed that this existential separation, brought about by religion, limited our human potential. Only by abandoning its delusions could we truly flourish. Of course, the group's iconoclastic, many would say blasphemous ideas had wider implications. The relationship between church and state was tight to the point of total union. Criticism of religion was tantamount to criticism of Prussia. Marx had aspired to an academic career, but the Prussian authorities would not tolerate subversives in their universities. So he had to find another platform for his ideas. His outlet would be the hot, rapidly expanding business of journalism. Marx thought that the written word had transformative power, and he became editor of the Rhineland News, based in Cologne. A mouthpiece for liberal entrepreneurs pushing for constitutional reform. He made an immediate impact.
Nicknamed the Moor because of his dark complexion and thick mane of hair and beard, it seems he was impetuous, passionate, with a boundless energy and self-confidence, although some did say that he was vindictive and an intellectual bully. But whatever his shortcomings, his drive and acuity got the job done. Under his tenure, circulation of the paper rose dramatically.
Marx's journalism took up the cause of his nouveau riche paymasters and attacked the old political elite.
Here's a typical example of his lacerating style. It's polemic, laced with a kind of withering sarcasm. The aristocracy cannot be given the form of law because they are formations of lawlessness. No one's action ceases to be wrongful because it's his custom, just as the bandit son of a robber is not exonerated because banditry is a family idiosyncrasy. It's clever, cutting stuff.
Marx gained notoriety through his thinly veiled attacks on the Prussian ruling classes. But journalism also stimulated a new interest at the other end of the social scale. In 1842, Marx reported on the conditions of lower-class vine growers back in his home region. A dramatic drop in profits had plunged them into poverty.
There's an unsettling poem written at the time that describes how, unable to feed their children, the vine growers were driven to suicide. Now the wine's blessing won't run in your barrel. You won't sing a song anymore when all is covered with snow. The workers blamed the authorities for opening up the market to greater competition. The authorities' response was that a protected market before had artificially inflated prices.
These were men and women who were really struggling. Officially, they were no longer allowed to collect firewood for free because it was being consumed in such vast quantities by the new factories. They were caught in a pincer movement of progress.
Marx saw that the vine growers were losing what little power they had to determine their own futures. His journalism opened his eyes to the complex forces governing our everyday lives.
He thought it should be possible, with scientific precision, to work out what these relations are. Just listen to what he wrote. This can be determined with almost the same certainty as a chemist determines under which external conditions given substances will form a compound. But a clinical deconstruction of the nature of society was just the sort of thing the Prussian authorities feared. Marx's provocations had ruffled the feathers of those in power once too often. His paper was shut down.
So we should picture Marx, aged just 25, angry, ambitious, criticised. Censured in Prussia, he resolved to travel to the fulcrum of game-changing, provocative ideas. The origin of those protest songs that his father once sang. The rallying point of revolution.
Marx's intellectual horizons expanded exponentially here. The rebellious fervour of the French Revolution had never really evaporated, and the streets and bars were home to radical thinkers whose ideas threatened to turn society upside down.
There were libertarian anarchists who declared that all property was theft, utopian socialists who sought common ownership of the means of production, and communists who advocated the creation of workers' cooperatives known as communes.
In just over a year of frenetic discussion and writing, the shape of Marx's own agitating philosophy would start to form. And this was a new chapter in more ways than one. He'd arrived with his childhood sweetheart and now wife, Jenny von Westphalen.
The two had enjoyed the trappings of a well-to-do lifestyle back in Trier. She was the daughter of a baron, and her father had introduced Marx to liberal thinkers and writers like Shakespeare. But here in Paris, they had to turn their back on creature comforts and salon society.
The newlyweds lodged here on Rue Vanneau with friends. And it was from here that Marx continued to agitate for change in Prussia.
Marx helped to launch an ambitious publication that encouraged collaboration between French and Prussian radicals. Actually, there was only ever one edition because of the difficulty, partly, of smuggling it into Prussia. But the early essays that Marx wrote for this failed publication are both historic gold and pivotal in the evolution of his ideas. In these essays, we can start to piece together Marx's quest to identify exactly what it is that limits humanity's freedom. He's starting to take a different course from the young Hegelians. Rather than seeing religion as the root cause of our problems, he describes it simply as the opium of the people, just a painkiller for something much more deep-seated.
The true source of our woes, as he saw it, was the way that society was organised to supply our material needs. The capitalist economy.
There have been decades of discussion of religion in Germany. Marx thinks that that is relatively superficial, understanding that really the world we live in is a world of work, a world of productivity, and it's this that affects us and the way that our lives go.
There's a phrase that he uses which is our species essence, and I've never quite understood it. Can you explain that to me?
Species essence for Marx primarily is about the way in which we human beings differ from other animals. And the key idea for Marx is that human beings are essentially productive beings. Other animals, bees, beavers, do produce, but not like us. That bees can only produce one thing, beavers produce one thing, we can produce anything. Marx thinks that all human beings are creative in the way we produce, but the tragedy of capitalism is workers in a factory, they're simply engaging in repetitive tasks. They're not doing the things that human beings ought to be doing. Now, Marx uses this notion of alienation from our species essence to explain not only the way that the individual worker is sort of crushed and chained to the production line, but also the way in which we human beings are together collectively dominated by the world. Even the capitalist actually is dominated. If a capitalist wanted to cut the working day, that probably wouldn't be possible because competitors would exploit workers just as much as before. You'd lose profit, you'd go out of business. And so in this way, Marx said, under capitalism, we become playthings of alien forces. It's almost like a monster that we've created. It's not something we control.
Now that Marx saw the world in a different way, he set out to expose its workings. With his ferocious intellect, and arguably too the bold conviction of youth, he resolved to end degrading injustice and to reunite people with their true, innate being.
But Marx's philosophical mission would be beset by personal battles. Marx suffered bad health, in particular a painful skin condition. New research suggests that what he referred to as boils was in fact something far more serious.
Well, I read an account of his life. It was quite an interesting book, but it said he suffered really quite badly from a skin complaint. Naturally, I picked up my ears and they said that he couldn't find a place to rest. He couldn't lie down, he couldn't walk. For 3 weeks at one point, he was totally unable to work, totally unable to think. But I thought, the skin complaint they said that he was suffering from was just boils. Well, boils are a bit of a nuisance, but they're not that bad. And I looked at Marx's letters over a period of about 9 years. Bit tedious, but you could see from these letters he gets them in the groins, he gets them around the anus, and then very diagnostically under the arms. Now, this distribution only occurs in one disease. It's a thing called hidradenitis suppurativa,
Right.
a rather terrible, unpronounceable name.
It sounds as though it's very debilitating physically.
Absolutely. Here's, for example, an armpit. It's scarred where there's been repeated episodes. It never really stands still.
Do we know when he developed this?
The first traces I found in the letters was in his early 40s. We know it starts in the early 20s. The average age is about 21, 22.
So we think that this affected him psychologically?
When the skin is involved, our self-image changes. It produces a self-loathing. And Marx had this by the gallon. In a letter here, he writes, "I took a sharp razor and lanced the cur myself."
Yeah.
How can you do that?
Yeah.
He regarded his disease as foreign to him.
Some have suggested that this condition would have added to Marx's sense of alienation. The new evidence certainly reminds us that towering thinkers also live a flesh and blood existence.
In 1840.
All right, that is all we're going to watch today. So do you guys have any questions or comments? I wasn't really looking at the chat. But one of the things that I like about this particular documentary related to Marx is that it brings kind of the intersectionality of what it was like for his existence as just a person, right? Makes him more human. We can get a sense of his struggles as a youth, you know, being under the all-imposing thumb of aristocracy, with his father's determination. No, you have to do it this way. No, I don't want to do it that way. To just the humanality of, he suffered in some kind of skin disease that, you know, science is trying to explain in modern language. And we will see how that will play out. And his evolution of thinking, right? That just because you might assume that something is your enemy or the evil of, or your target for the revolution, evolution of thinking, constantly evolving in the way in which you perceive based on your own experiences and based on what you see. So that we can't just put these thinkers on a shelf and say, oh, well, this is how they would have thought about it. No, they show us over the course of time that all of this is a constant changing course in this, whatever we call it, progress, history. And from all of that, we have to constantly be reevaluating the way in which we interpret and the way in which we explain. And this is, I know, sometimes frustrating, but there is no one right way to interpret things. We have got to be evolutionary in our own thinking and perception as well. And keep an open mind. All right, so no questions. So just before I let you guys go, if you have not yet taken the quiz or the test, I'm sorry, before we went on break, please schedule that time if you've got questions about it. let me know and we can schedule a time to talk about it. Otherwise, I will see you guys on Thursday. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.